What's up, everyone? In this episode of What the Fast, we are going to be talking about aero. Now, aero is probably the most misunderstood part of tuning a car, and is often just, well, neglected by car enthusiasts and hobby-level motorsport guys because, well, let's face it, it's pretty confusing once you start learning about it. Now, manufacturers and race teams spend millions of dollars on aero development, just trying to get the tiny little bit of advantage, and for good reason. It affects every single part of the car. It affects acceleration, it affects cornering, it affects stability, even affects fuel efficiency as well. And the reason they spend so much is they often have to work within a lot of constraints. You've got to work to a budget, you've got to work to practicality, you've got to work to legality when it comes to road cars, and for race teams you need to work within a set of rules and regulations. Now, when it comes to aero, the topic is so big that we could probably do a video every day for the next 50 years and not run out of things to talk about when it comes to aero. In fact, I'm convinced that the subject of aero, when it comes to just cars, let alone anything else, is probably a bigger topic than every other part of the car put together. But in this video, what we want to look at is the basics of aero and just look at some of the basic truths and the basic myths that we see in the car scene. And trust me, there is a lot of myths when it comes to aero on your car. Now, I studied aeronautical engineering in the Air Force, so I understand just the very basics of how air works and know the lingos. However, I got to work with Andrew Brilliant from AMB Aero, a well-known aerodynamicist, back in 2014 when we did the Aero for Jet 200, and that was a complete eye-opener about how aero works on a car. Now, if you're going to develop aero as a race team or take it very seriously, then the real way to do it is with CFD and or wind tunnel testing, computational fluid dynamics. Basically, you design the aero and then you test it within a CFD program to work out, well, basically, did it work or not, and obviously wind tunnel testing as well. Now, that's pretty expensive and a lot of work. So what Andrew Brilliant came up with is what he calls best practice. They're basic modifications you can do to your car that he knows will definitely increase downforce, but it just won't optimize the drag on the car. It's basically a sledgehammer approach to doing aero on your car. But I will say this, it works. We've taken seconds off our lap time by doing best practice aero on our Silvia. So that's the basis of what we're going to look at in this video for What the Fast. Now, we're going to presume that you've got some basic knowledge on aero or modifying a car, but what we will do first is go over some of the basics. So first up, let's take an aeroplane. You have lift, which is basically what's keeping it in the air. So you have gravity and weight, which is what makes it want to fall out of the sky. You have thrust from the engines, making it move forward. And then you have drag. Now, when it comes to a car, you still have thrust from your engine. You have drag created by the car itself. Lift, which is bad because it's trying to lift the car off the ground, but instead of gravity and weight, you now have downforce. Now, for aerodynamics, that's all you have to consider, but you do consider weight and downforce because they add together when you start looking at things to do with tyres and suspension and everything else. But we're just going to stick to the basics for now. So for those of you that know nothing about aerodynamics, just a very, very quick lesson. So here is a wing off a plane. That is the aerofoil shape that most of you will be familiar with. Essentially, there's a couple of different ways that it creates lift. So to visualize it, let's get two air molecules at the front here. They get split by the wing. One goes over the top, one goes over the bottom and meet back here. The one over the top has further to travel. Now, for it to get back to here, because the wing is basically splitting the air apart, the air isn't moving over it, for it to get to here and meet back up with that air particle, it needs to go faster. So, Bernoulli's theorem is, when it comes to air, if the air goes faster in a system, the pressure drops. So, with the air going over the top or having further to travel, we basically end up with a low pressure above the wing, which means we have a relative high pressure below it. And what happens when you get a high pressure below the wing and a low pressure above it? You get a force, and that force is lift. Now, this topic can go down into a book of tens of thousands of pages when it comes to the design of aerofoils and just how efficient they can be and what they can do and how they work. But that is the basic fundamental. Now, another fundamental of lift is just literally pure force. If you can imagine air coming this way and hitting a flat surface on an angle, essentially, it'll then bounce off it. That force down, the counteractor of that, is lift. Want to try it? Drive along in your car at 100 k's an hour, put your hand out the window flat, put it on an angle, your arm will go in the air. The faster you go, the more your arm will go in the air. That is another basic fundamental of how lift is created by an aerofoil or even just by an object. So one is to do with pressure and one is just to do with pure force onto that item. But here's the thing though, here's where it gets more interesting. Air hitting this on the bottom will bounce down like this, but the air that goes up over the top will separate and become turbulent. All this turbulence is drag. What does drag do? Slows your car down. The more drag you have on a car means the more thrust that you need to fight your way through it. Air can basically become a brick wall. It's why cars have a top speed, and if you want to go past that top speed, you need more and more power. That's why the Bugatti Chiron has 1,500 horsepower to go as fast as it does. So you either need to increase power or optimize aero when it comes to your top speed and even just your acceleration. That's why a car accelerates really hard up until about 150 k's an hour and you just feel acceleration fall off. That is drag fighting the engine of your car. So that's the basic principles. Now, obviously, when we make a wing, we don't want one with heaps of drag like that, so optimising the aerofoil essentially is you want the most amount of lift, or in the case of a car, flip it upside down and downforce, but you want the least amount of drag. So essentially, the wing you see on the back of a car and other parts on the car all derive from this. So on a car, it just means the wing is upside down and it's trying to push it into the ground. So the last fundamental principle to talk about is why do we even want downforce on a car? Well, for passenger cars, drag cars, and other cars looking for maximum fuel efficiency, they don't necessarily want any downforce, they just want to stop lift. Because if you can imagine, if you're getting air under the car and it's creating lift, makes the car unstable. You know when you go over a hill and the car gets really light, the steering gets really light, the car is very unstable. So we want to decrease lift and reduce drag when it comes to a drag car or something that's fuel efficient. But when you get to motorsport, you want downforce. Essentially, downforce is just pushing the car into the ground, pushing the tyres down harder onto the ground, which enables the tyres to have more grip. And if they have more grip, well, you can go around a corner faster. That is the fundamental principle of aerodynamics when it comes to motorsport.
Much of the information and the work on Jet 200 in this feature are part of an AMB Aero best practices package. These packages start from as little as $2,000. Andrew Brilliant has let us release this information to help our viewers make better informed choices on aero parts, avoiding counterfeit and ones that don't work, plus better understand aero. AMB Aero will be releasing more video features in the future on specific topics and aero parts.
Now, what we're going to do is we're going to use the Cars in Motive Garage to go piece by piece over the car and basically explain how each part of the car works. First up, we're going to talk about probably the most misunderstood part of aero, and that is cooling. So when we worked on Jet 200 with Andrew Brilliant, the first thing that he said that needed to be done when modifying a car is the cooling system. He said it all starts with the cooling system, because if you can't get that right, the car won't run right, and the rest of the aerodynamics of the car is essentially built around what the cooling system requirements are. Now, as you know, if you look at a front bar, it's got a bunch of holes in it. Some goes into a radiator, some intercooler, some oil cooler. Some of the holes in the front bar even feed the brakes. Now, if you think about that, the air's got to go somewhere. Now, when it hits something, it creates drag, just the nature of air hitting something. Now, the more efficient your radiator or intercooler is in terms of its design to let air through will determine how much drag. But at the end of the day, you can't fight the fact that you're going to have drag just purely by the air hitting the things in the cooling system. But once it's gone through what it needs to cool, think about where the air is going to go. All of that air rushing through your intercooler, radiator, etc. is going to end up in your engine bay. It hits your engine, it hits your firewall, and it gets trapped. It gets turbulent, it gets trapped in your engine bay, but it's got to get out somewhere, otherwise air can't come in. Now, in a factory passenger car, you've got a completely sealed bonnet, more to legal reasons than anything else, so that air is going to go under the car to get out. So let's look at it here. All this cold air coming in, all going to go in, it's all going to get trapped up in your firewall here, it's all going to get trapped and turbulent all in your engine. Where's it going to come out? It's going to come out under the back of the car. So if you've got all this air coming out from under the car, what's it going to do? It's going to create front end lift. And that's why most passenger cars, the faster you go, the more unstable they get. Essentially, air is being forced out under the front of the car and lifting up the front. You've now got less weight on the front tyres and the car just starts to get light steering. You've probably all felt that when you've driven your mum's Hyundai Excel to 150 k's an hour. So when it comes to aero and motorsport and even supercars, etc., we want to control where this air goes. We want air that comes in to go where we want it to go. And when it comes to cooling, we generally want to try and get it out through the bonnet. Now you'll see a lot of supercars will have a vented bonnet of some type, and you see that in a lot of race cars where essentially what they want to do is, let's just say you have a radiator like this, you will have a duct into the front bar where the air comes in, and then they might duct it out the bonnet like that. So air will come in through the radiator and out through the bonnet. This is in a perfect example where you can design it from scratch to have a sealed system. But you often can't do that when you're modifying your road car into a time attack car or race car. And what you'll do is you'll put bonnet vents in the bonnet and you're trying to get your air out through the bonnet like that. And we tend to call these things negative pressure ducts. So if you look at Jet 200, you can see that we have 3 negative pressure ducts on the bonnet of the car. Why are they called that? Well, it's quite simple really. They're designed to have air come over it, and the way that they're shaped creates a low pressure zone above the vent. What's that doing? Well, it's essentially sucking air out of the engine bay. If you just had an opening, it would be turbulent. So you have to use a well-designed negative pressure duct to make it work as a system. So all that turbulent air that's trapped in your engine bay now wants to come out of the negative pressure duct, go over the top of the car rather than coming at the bottom of the car and creating lift. Now, where you put these negative pressure ducts is actually very important. First things first, you can't have them too far forward because you've got your radiator here behind your rad support. So when we close the bonnet, you can imagine the back of the radiator is here. Having it any further forward, well, there's nothing to come out. So basically the start of the negative pressure duct is at the back of the radiator and then goes back from here. Now the other thing with these ducts is you can't go too far back or they actually stop working. In fact, they start working in reverse. I'll explain why. As air comes over the bonnet, it hits the windscreen. And you can imagine all this air hitting the windscreen that now wants to try and get up and over it. And what ends up happening is a high pressure zone gets created along the bottom of the windscreen. Manufacturers know this. That's why a lot of air conditioners actually draw their air from this section. That high pressure zone here actually wants to force air into any opening. So if the negative pressure duct is too far back, a high pressure zone will actually force air back into the vent. Now, have you ever seen muscle cars with a reverse cowl scoop? That's how that works. They have a big cowl like this, an opening at the back, and the engine bay or the air filter, etc., whatever induction system they've got, actually draws air from this high pressure zone. And that explains why you see reverse cowl scoops, which leads us to one of the biggest myths when it comes to modifying your car, and that is the raised bonnet. You see a lot of drifters, I've seen a lot of GDR guys do it. They actually raise the back of their bonnet to try and let hot air out. Now, when you're stationary, it will do that because the thermo fan on your radiator will blow air through the engine bay and let it escape out the back of the bonnet. So when you're doing nothing sitting there, the car probably will cool down a little bit quicker because heat can escape somewhere. But as soon as you have any decent speed, you actually have the opposite. The high pressure zone at the bottom of the windscreen will actually force air back into the engine bay, which has a few problems. Not only does it not let the hot air escape, if you can imagine, you've got air coming in from the front, air coming in from the back, they hit each other, they become stagnant and actually helps stop airflow through your engine bay. Your cooling system will now work even worse than it did before, and all that air hitting each other, where's that going to go? Well, under the car, more front end lift. It is like a triple lose scenario once the car is moving. However, some people go, I don't care, helps the car cool down quicker after I've done a run. So really, that's the payoff. Do you want your car to cool down after you run when you stopped, or do you want your cooling system to work correctly when you're moving? When it comes to cars that do a lot of high speed, circuit, time attack, etc., obviously you want it to work better when you're moving. All right, so I'll put it in a diagram, right? So there's the guard line. So just now, I'll over-exaggerate it a bit, but there's your bonnet, and you've raised it up at the back here to let air out. Now, when you're not moving, your thermo fan will blow air through your engine bay, and your hot air can go out like that. You can get your hot air out of there and cool down a little bit better. However, when you're moving, Now we're going to have air coming over the bonnet, and as it hits the bottom of the windscreen, like I said, we're going to create this high pressure zone right here, and that air is actually going to want to come back in the engine bay. So now you've got air coming into the engine bay, stopping any hot air from coming out. Now the air coming through your engine bay here that wants to get out of here is being met by this air. Now you end up with heaps of stagnation here. The air can't move, and that basically blocks the whole system. So now your radiator, intercooler, etc. actually don't work as well. So you've got air fighting each other, which is what you don't want. So the moral of the story really is, if you want a better cooling system, you need to work on controlling the flow of air. And that either means creating ducting in your engine bay to get it out of the bonnet, or having negative pressure ducts to suck the air out of the engine bay. You'll have less front end lift, you'll have a better cooling system, and also just have less drag by letting the air out nicely. So it's a triple win if you do your bonnet vents correctly. Now, another way to control the air as part of your cooling system and your aero is just by how much you physically let into the engine bay. Now, a lot of cars that you look at have a whole bunch of openings. They feed the radiator, they feed the air conditioning condenser, they feed the intercooler, oil cooler, you can have air going to the brakes. There's all sorts of places that air needs to go through the front bar. Now, in a street car where most of your speeds are below 110 k's an hour, or in, say, a drift car where you're not really worried about downforce, you're worried about maximum cooling potential at lower speeds, you basically need all these big openings. But as you go faster, whether it's drag or circuit racing, time attack, or an exotic car, as you go faster, you can imagine that faster air can do more cooling work than what slower air can. So the faster you go, essentially the less air that you need to get into the engine bay. Now, when we worked on Jet 200, we used to have these big vents on the side here and a big vent here in the center, and we blocked them all off. Because essentially, we knew we could get enough air to do what we needed just from this center opening. So purely by blocking off the side vents and that center vent means that the air, now instead of getting trapped in the engine bay, is forced to go where we want it, either around the car or over the car, which means less drag, because it's not getting trapped inside, and less front end lift. This is why you see a lot of drag cars just totally seal up the front end of the car. They don't want to let any air in. If they're on methanol and they've got a billet block or whatever, they don't even need any air at all. So they have no air go in and get trapped. It all goes over the top. And you'll notice that a lot of supercars will have small vents that direct air where they want it. Now, essentially in Jet 200, we only needed to get air to an intercooler and a radiator, and we knew that the faster we went, essentially the less opening we needed. And we spend most of our time well over 100 k's an hour. So a small opening like this was more than enough. But the other thing we also did was duct the air, or guide it where we wanted to go. Now, you see a lot of people with body kits, they have an intercooler, and the intercooler sits 10 centimeters back from where their front bar finishes. Now, air will always take the path of least resistance. So if it comes into your bar and hits your intercooler, it might not want to go through your intercooler, it'll go around it. It'll bleed underneath it, it'll bleed around the sides, it'll bleed over the top, which means your intercooler isn't basically working as well as it should be, and the air is just going wherever it likes. We call this bleed air, essentially. So what you want to do is put a duct in there to guide air to where you want it to go. So we have a duct, it forces the air to go through the intercooler on the radiator, and then our negative pressure ducts suck it out through the top. But here's where it gets more interesting. So if you can imagine inside the engine bay, a radiator that tall, let's say an intercooler that tall. Now, most people, the opening in the front bar might be as big as all of that, let's say, and a duct that goes straight, which means the air coming into the front bar, as it comes in, will hit the intercooler and radiator at the same speed that it's doing out here. Now, the faster the air is going, the more drag you create. We've already asserted that. So as it hits, some of it's just going to build up around the front of the intercooler on the radiator, because the intercooler on the radiator can only flow so much air through it at a time. And they obviously can't flow as much as what the air is moving, so you're just going to have a build-up of high pressure and some turbulence and drag in front of the intercooler on the radiator. Because you're just going to reach a point where more airspeed isn't going to really do any more cooling. So what we did is the opening in our front bar is only half the height of the intercooler and even less than half the height of the radiator. Why is that, you ask? Well, now the duct that we put on has to essentially open up like this. Now, air coming in into here now has to spread out like this. When air has the chance to spread out like that, it will actually slow down. So when the air comes in through our front bar opening now, it has the chance to expand once it's inside the duct, because our duct opens up to meet the size of the intercooler and the radiator. So as this air expands, it actually slows down. And that's a very similar principle to what we spoke about before when it comes to a wing. I'll go back to Bernoulli's theorem. If you can imagine an hourglass like this, and I spoke about air coming in, and that once it gets put into a small space like this, like when you go over a wing, before it comes back out the other side, in here, the air is forced to accelerate and get a low pressure, which is how the wing works. But as it comes out the other side and it expands, it actually slows back down again. And that's the principle we're using in here. So we're slowing the air down when it comes inside the duct, which means it can do its work more effectively onto the cooling system. So what does that all kind of mean in the real world? Well, let's just say the intercooler and the radiator, the maximum speed at which they're still, efficient is 100 kilometers per hour. And any speed you go over that is just creating essentially more drag. Well, if air's coming in at 150 k's an hour, comes into the opening in our front bar, it's ducted to expand and slow down, it'll then slow down to 100 k's an hour and do its job more efficiently. So in summary, having the duct forces the air to go through the radiator and the intercooler. Having the duct expand up slows the air down, so the fast moving air out there can actually be used more efficiently on your cooling system. We now have less air in the engine bay that we need to get out of the negative pressure ducts, and now our cooling system is working better. We've got less front end lift, and we've probably got more downforce as well. So that is why the cooling system aero is so important. Now obviously all of this is a balancing act, because you can't always have your cake and eat it. So for example, on Jet 200, we drilled these 2 holes in our side vent here to let fresh, cool air into where the air filter sits. Now, normally, on a cold day, we had enough bleed air just, moving around the car to get into where the air filter is, but we found on a hot day, our intake air temps did go up a little bit. So we just drilled these 2 holes to let air straight in to the air filter. So essentially, it's just a trade-off between your engine performance and your aero. So everything with aero is just a trade-off to something else. And we'll go back to what we said before about drag cars. They basically have the least amount of openings that they possibly can. A top speed car would be similar. Like I said, make the air work for you. Least amount of air trying to go through your bar and get it trapped into your engine bay. Another little thing to look at is actually your panel gaps. You'll notice drag car guys seal up their bonnet and front bar with gaffer tape. And even a lot of time attack guys totally seal up their front end. And that's just all about controlling bleed air. Bleed air is essentially where it leaks. So if I'm trying to make it go up over the bonnet of the car, bleed air can actually fit in this gap below the factory headlight I put back in. So I'm gonna have to put a little rubber seal in here so that air can't bleed back in there again. And that's why a lot of guys use masking tape or gaffer tape all over the car to seal it up. It makes it less drag because bleed air can create turbulence, less drag from turbulence, less drag because you're obviously controlling the air to where you want it to go, which means better performance. And that's really what aero is all about. So with the cooling system, like I said, it is just a balancing act between keeping your engine cool, having engine performance and brake performance, versus controlling and managing where the air goes through the engine bay and then trying to get it out. Now, another area on the car that gets a lot of air trapped into it that causes front end lift and drag is the wheel arches. Now, if you can imagine, if air's come through your front bar, it's now gone into your wheel arch, you've got this wheel spinning around, creating a lot of turbulence, and essentially it also gets trapped at the back of the wheel arch. So now you have a high pressure zone inside the wheel arch, which wants it to push its way up into this low pressure zone. So you get front end lift, and you also get a lot of drag. So controlling air through and around the wheel arch is actually pretty important. Now, if you look at a lot of time attack cars, or even a Porsche GT2 or GT3 RS, they have a vent in their front fender, and essentially what that's allowing is the high pressure zone that's trapped in here now actually has somewhere to go. It's letting the air out of the wheel arch the same way the negative pressure ducts let the air out of the engine bay. Another trend you'll notice in time attack is shaping the area behind the wheel arch like this, where it curves in, because basically rather than trapping the air in the wheel arch behind the tyre, you're just trying to get the air out of there. Essentially, half of aero is not just where the air goes in the first place, it's just trying to get it out of there. So with the wheel arch, everything we're trying to do on Jet 200 here is just try to get the air out of the wheel arch, because at the end of the day, any air that gets trapped creates a high pressure zone, creates front end lift, creates drag. Now, another thing you need to do to control airflow is make sure that you block airflow going into the wheel arches. Factory cars have that, they've got plastic liners, but a lot of modified cars throw all that stuff out, but it's pretty important. So in Jet 200, we actually built a total new inner wheel arch on the front side so that no air that goes in through the front of the car can escape into the wheel arch. We're trying to minimise the amount of air that goes into the wheel arch because it's very turbulent there, a lot of drag is created in there, and that's where a lot of front end lift happens in a car. So you want to block all airflow into the wheel arches. I know that some people have oil cooler outlets and things like that there, but that's why you see some front bars actually have an oil cooler outlet in the side of the front bar. So it's actually ducted through, comes out the side and around the car rather than going into the wheel arch. So controlling air into the wheel arch is a very, very important part of the aero. All right, let's go back to the front of the car now, and we're going to talk about flat floors, splitters, diffusers, and canards. Now, first up, a flat floor on a car actually has a lot of benefits for multiple different reasons. All right, now if you can imagine, if we put a flat floor on that car, the air that wanted to go underneath and give lift is now either trapped or, if you've got good venting, it's forced to go out. Now, if all of the air in the engine bay is forced to go out through the top and can't go underneath, you're naturally going to reduce front end lift. Now, flat floor also reduces drag. So as it goes under the car, it just has a smooth surface that can just come out the other end. Now, when you've got differentials and gearboxes and exhaust hanging everywhere, the air underneath just hits it and goes turbulent. And what does turbulent air do? Create drag. Also, turbulent air moves around underneath the car, can create more front end lift as well. So by having a flat floor underneath the car, you just have smoother airflow, so less drag. That's why a lot of European and high-end cars have a flat floor. It won't always just be for downforce, it'll actually just be to have smooth flow under there and less drag. That's why a lot of front-wheel drives or hybrids and things like that, it's a good idea to have a flat floor. It makes them more aerodynamically efficient in terms of drag. And also, less front-end lift for the reasons we talked about. All right, let's take things one step further with a flat floor. I'm going to over-exaggerate this, but now I want you to imagine a flat floor that goes the whole way that's curved like that. What does that remind you of that we spoke about earlier? Air comes in, hits this, has to accelerate through here because the distance between the air and the ground is fixed, and all this accelerated air through here creates a low pressure zone. So a flat floor increases downforce because the air that has to accelerate into that gap under the car is essentially making the entire car an upside down wing. That is the fundamental principle of how a flat floor creates downforce. We're just creating a low pressure under the car. Now, that's a very crude way of explaining it. So what really happens in the real world is you're actually more likely to have kind of like a little wing section here, you might have another little section here, and then your rear diffuser here. So you'll actually have three areas where the flat floor joins together to create different curves and shapes to create downforce. Now, taking it one step further again with a flat floor that we see in pro-class time attack cars and open wheelers, etc., is rather than just having a flat floor with a bit of shape to it, they actually build tunnels inside the car that when you can't see them side on, but essentially, sort of like from under the wheel arch, you'll just see a tunnel will come up like this, and you have this whole section inside the car. Now, if you think about that like a wing, you now have essentially this giant wing built into the underside of your car. If you look at the back of under Suzuki's car and things like that, you'll make it quite noticeable. So now the air coming under the car flows up like this and out through the back of the car like that. So essentially, the entire underneath of the car has become an upside down wing. This topic can go on for a long time. So we're just going to end it there with the basic fundamentals of how a flat floor can create a low pressure zone under the car, so you get more downforce. You'll see it in pretty much every supercar, high-end exotics, etc. There's so much stuff underneath the car controlling the airflow, it's crazy. We will talk about the separate diffusers you can have front and rear later in this video as well. So let's move on to the next bit, because this is yeah, we go for a long time on this. So now we're going to talk about the easiest upgrade you can do to any car to give it some extra downforce, better aero, and better performance at the track, and that is a splitter. Now, essentially, a splitter sits at the bottom of your front bar and just pokes out like that. It can be quite crude, it can be quite basic. It literally just pokes out. And the reason it's called a splitter is when air comes along, it has a choice. It can go under the splitter or it can go over the splitter. Now the air that goes over the splitter essentially hits the bottom of the front bar and creates a pocket of trapped air right here. Now we've said that turbulent air that gets trapped, or air that's just slamming into the front bar, what's it going to do? It's going to create a high pressure zone. Now we have a high pressure zone above the splitter, we have normal air or a low pressure zone below the splitter, and now we have downforce. Let's take a look at Jet 200. So on Jet 200, you can see that our splitter sticks out about 20 centimetres. We have to stick within class regulations. Club Sprint would be shorter, Pro Class can be longer. So the air that comes over the top, essentially, the good thing is you can see it here with this black plastic strip that seals up the bottom of the bar. Air just hits here. And when it hits here, it gets trapped and it spins around and gets all turbulent. And we're just creating a high pressure zone. So that high pressure zone extends all the way across the top of the splitter and all the way around to the side. We're just trapping air. And once we trap that air in that section, get a high pressure zone, we get downforce. Now, because you've got downforce on the splitter, you need to factor in things like the strength and how it's made. Now, you will see a lot of people put a splitter on their car, go to the track, tear the thing straight off. Happens all the time. Because even just an extended front lip is acting like a splitter as well. But this is obviously how you do a splitter correctly. Now, for these things to work, they've got to be strong. 105 kilos on the splitter, no problem whatsoever. So when you have a splitter, you actually need to make sure that the top of the splitter goes to, in a way, a flat surface. If this section here was smooth into the duct, it wouldn't create a high pressure zone here. It would just be directing air into the vent. So our splitter works by essentially having just a blunt surface that the air hits, which creates a high pressure zone and pushes down on the front. So as we move around to the side of the splitter, things get a little bit more complicated. Getting this area correct really does need to be done in CFD, but there is some basic principles here. For example, we have a fence along the side of the splitter here for the same reason that we have a winglet on the end of a Boeing 737's wings. Essentially what you're stopping is the high pressure on the top and the low pressure on the bottom. Without that fence, they would just spill into each other and you would lose downforce along the edge of the splitter. Same as a plane, you can imagine the air would roll over the top of the wing and you would lose lift around that section of the wing. So this fence is basically stopping the air from trying to meet each other around the edge of the splitter. We also continue that fence along the back here, and for us, that's just another case of catching more air. This section in here is basically doing the same thing as the entire splitter. Air is hitting that, getting trapped, and now we get downforce on top of the splitter. How aggressive you get in this bit basically depends on how much downforce you want to have. It does create a lot of drag though, so it's just a balance off between drag and downforce. We used to have actually a bigger catchment area here, had more downforce, very draggy. Another thing you can also see that we've done around here with Jet 200 is we've actually got a metal plate that sticks out to the side here, which is all about trying to stop air from directly hitting the tyre. If you can imagine a tyre, it's spinning. As it spins, that is spinning against a layer of air, and that layer of air gets a lot of turbulence on it, and that turbulence just expands around the tyre. So we're trying to stop air from hitting the front of the tyre because they're so wide and stick out of the car, which is basically the reason why you see supercars, they don't have stance-style offsets. All of their wheels sit inside the bodywork to stop that drag being created by air hitting the front of the tyre. So the splitter itself is actually quite simple, and it really is only this front section here that you actually call the splitter. What happens further back and underneath is where things get a little bit more interesting. Our entire splitter diffuser assembly on the front is basically takes up from where it starts to the back of the front bumper and is flat underneath. That essentially gives us a flat floor section under the front of the car. And like we spoke about before, that's going to stop all the air in this section of the engine bay from trying to go under the car and helps try and get it out of the engine bay and out through the negative pressure ducts. The other thing it also does is you can put a diffuser into the splitter that you've built for your car. That section on our car, we'll draw it up here. What would happen is the front part would be a splitter like this, but then sections of it actually go like that. Now, if you can imagine, looking at it from side on, the first section might be completely flat, but you'll often see sections in front of the tyre that are curved up like this. And like everything else we've drawn, you've just created an upside down wing. So now, bam, low pressure, high pressure. So if I pull that splitter and front diffuser section off, essentially there is just sections of it that are curved at the back. So your initial side on look, it might just look flat, but underneath there will be sections like that. Now you can't do that in the center of the car generally because the engine's in the way. So you'll generally find the section of the front splitter and diffuser that looks like that is the section in front of the tyres. And we're just basically putting an upside down wing under the front of the car. You see a lot of time attack cars though, as that front diffuser section gets bigger and bigger and bigger and bigger, they almost get to the point where essentially the entire front splitter diffuser assembly is just one giant upside down wing. Look at the Porsche, look at under Suzuki's car, and even look at the Hammerhead that has little wings that stick out the side. So essentially a front diffuser is an upside down wing that is built into your splitter. So you can start at the entry level, just have a flat splitter, and then you work your way up into having a front diffuser as well. Now, a basic concept of aero that's often overlooked is just simply turbulence and keeping things smooth on the car. I'll give you an example. Bunch of bonnet gauges sitting here, air hits it, goes over it, creates turbulence. If you have a hole in your bonnet to let an engine partly stick out because it doesn't fit, if you can imagine the air hitting that, goes over it, becomes turbulent. If you have a turbo sticking out, right? Now, in most cases, you've probably got the turbo sticking out so it can just draw air, ram directly into it to help make more power. But just remember, the air that doesn't go through it and hits it, bam, turbulence. So with aero, it's a lot about keeping things smooth. But like I said before, it's a balancing act. So one example to look at when it comes to aerodynamics and just having a smooth surface is Cletus's Leroy Corvette. It doesn't have a body over it, but it runs sevens. In that instance, it's just pure horsepower driving that thing through the air. Would it be quicker or more efficient, etc., if it had a body over it? Well, yeah, it would. The aero would be much better and much better controlled. Probably the car would probably be more stable as well. But he only uses it for drag racing, and the only time it's going fast is down a quarter mile. The other thing you've got to look at is would the weight of the body then make it slower, but then the aerodynamics would make it quicker and cancel each other out? Well, you don't know without testing, but when it comes to high-end drag cars, you know they try to make them as smooth as possible to get the car through the air with the least amount of drag. So sounds like a simple process, but the more things you hang off the side of your car and have hanging out of the bonnet and hanging out everywhere, the more drag it's going to have. Last topic to talk about at the front of the car is canards. I like them. I think they look great. However, 90% of the time, in fact, probably 99% of the time when you buy a canard for the front of your car, it probably doesn't work. And after conversation with Andrew Brilliant regarding canards, unless you CFD design them or make them so big they work by pure blunt force, most of the little canards that you see on Mercedes brand new or little ones you bought for your Evo, etc., they don't do anything. They just look good. There's nothing wrong with that, but you just need to acknowledge that they're probably not doing anything. Now, a canard basically just works the same way as an upside down wing or aerofoil as well, and that is, as air hits it, the top section will generate a high pressure zone on the top just from hitting the top of it. If it's shaped correctly, the bottom side can get a little bit of low pressure, and then you just create downforce again. But obviously a canard on my car to work would need to sit out like this. Now I could put it on this car, get some more downforce, but I probably don't need it. At the moment, the downforce is balanced really well from front to back. If I needed more front downforce, creating some large canards would be the way to do that. There are so many different designs and ways that you can do canards. We could be here all day talking about it, but just like everything else on the car, canards are just a balancing act between how much drag and how much downforce you want on the front of the car. But like I said, if you're buying them off eBay and they're just little things, they just look pretty. For a canard to do some serious work, it needs to be a serious size in the same way that the splitter needs to be that big to do its job. So that pretty much is all of the basics of the front end of a car when it comes to aero. In our next episode of What the Fast with Aero, we're going to talk about the back of the car.